Welcome back to Killer Stories. I'm your host, Bobby Holmes. I have some exciting news. I have my first sponsor for the podcast. Falcon Settlement Incorporated provides safe and reliable title work and real estate settlements. Falcon has provided top quality real estate services at very competitive rates for lenders, realtors, buyers, and sellers since 1982. They strive to provide timely and organized services, scheduling closings at your convenience. Their home office is located in Hawthorne, Pennsylvania, with a branch office in DuBois, Pennsylvania. For more information, visit falconsettlement.com. If you are interested in sponsoring an episode of Killer Stories, email me at killersstoriespodcast@gmail.com. Okay, it's time to get to the good stuff. I've got another spooky episode for you this week. Not spooky paranormal like the Amityville Horror. If you believe anything paranormal even happened in that home, that is all circumstantial. But this story is spooky because the murder happened on Halloween night. I'm covering a case from 1957 dubbed the Trick-or-Treat Murders. Let's talk about our victim, Peter Fabiano. There isn't a ton of information I could find about who Peter was, but I'll share what little I did find. He was a U.S. Marine who served in World War II. After Peter was discharged, he began work as a truck driver in Kingston, New York. He met and fell in love with a woman named Betty. She was recently divorced, a single mom of 2 children. Peter welcomed her children with open arms. After Peter and Betty married in 1955, they moved to Los Angeles, California. It was there that Peter began working as a hairdresser and opened his own beauty salon. The salon did so well, he opened a second location, both in the San Fernando Valley area. Almost a year after the move to LA, Peter and Betty began to experience marital issues. They decided to separate. Betty moved out of their family home and crashed with a friend, Joan Rebel. Joan was a freelance writer and photographer, and she literally traveled the world as she worked. But when she landed in LA, she was employed at one of Peter's salons to make some extra money. And that is where she met and befriended Betty. Joan was divorced and single, allowing space for a roommate. During the time Betty and Joan lived together, they formed a very strong bond. Some might call it abnormal. Well, at least that's what they called it in the 1950s. What I'm referring to is a same-sex relationship. And I don't know the details. Maybe Betty was feeling down about her split with Peter, and Joan was there for her, creating feelings beyond friendship. Or perhaps she was a lesbian and had been denying her true self all these years. I'm not sure if Peter knew about the affair or just had a gut feeling, but he strongly disliked Joan. He became jealous of the time they spent together. Peter decided he wanted to give the marriage another chance. Betty moved home and they agreed to try and make it work. But Peter had stipulations. Betty was not allowed to see Joan anymore. She can't go there, and Joan can't come here. He didn't want Betty talking to her ever again. Even more dramatic, Peter forbid Betty to even speak about Joan. He basically wanted to pretend like Joan didn't exist and that his wife was 100% straight. Pretend all you want, Peter, but you can't just turn that off. Speaking of, I recently listened to Bailey Sarian's Dark History podcast about gay conversion therapy. Holy crap, what parents put their children through to try and change their sexual orientation is so horrific and sad. So many people pretended to quote-unquote be cured to avoid further torture, stepping back into the closet to spare themselves the disappointment of their families. So, at her husband's request, Betty cut all ties with Joan. Just to paint a picture for you, at this time Peter is 35, Betty is 36 or 39, depending on the source, and Joan is 40 years old. After the severed friendship, Joan was heartbroken. Now that Betty was gone, she yearned for that closeness again. A woman she knew for almost 3 years filled the void. 43-year-old Golden Pizer. Such an interesting name. I'm not exactly sure how it's pronounced, if it's Golden, Goldine, or Goldine. It's Goldyne. I'm going with Golden, and I'm sure that's wrong, but whatever. Golden was also divorced. She and Joan both had failed marriages because they were trying to fit the mold society had set for them. But the truth is, they were attracted to women, not men. And Betty may have been in the same boat, or perhaps she's bisexual or just experimenting. No matter the circumstance, Joan fell for her and then Peter took her away. Joan and Golden started to hang out on a daily basis. They spent most of their time together at a coffee shop gossiping. Joan talked about her relationship with Betty. She went on and on about how horrible Peter had treated her. He was abusive and controlling, which I don't doubt to be true. He was controlling who she can and can't talk to. Golden said, quote, "She painted him as a vile, evil man who wanted to destroy all people around him." Even though Golden had never met Peter, through Joan's stories, she developed a deep hatred for him. Their conversations were primarily about Joan being scorned by the Fabianos. Regardless of her obvious obsession with Betty, Golden became infatuated with Joan. She would do anything to please her. Their gossiping took a dark turn when Joan began fantasizing about Peter's death. At first, it may have been a joke, but things became more serious when they discussed how they would kill him. A knife is too messy. Poisoning might be difficult to execute. A gun. They decided shooting Peter was the best option. Golden went to a gun shop in Pasadena where she told a man working there that she wanted to buy a gun for home protection. He set her up with a .35 caliber Smith & Wesson. A few days later, Joan brought Golden back to the gun shop. Joan paid for the gun and 2 bullets. She kept it in her possession until the time was right. Weeks leading up to the murder, the 2 women patrolled the neighborhood. Joan pointed out Peter to Golden so that she could recognize the target. It was October, and the women thought that Halloween would be the perfect opportunity to commit the murder. They could be in a disguise and no one would suspect a thing. October 31st. Betty and Peter were at home handing out candy to trick-or-treaters. Meanwhile, Joan showed up at Golden's apartment with a costume, as in singular, 1 costume, and it was for Golden. Joan was going to be the getaway driver. She had convinced her new friend to commit murder for her. Again, Golden had never even met Peter, and here she was willing to kill him because she felt like he was a threat to her friend, or lover, whatever they were. It was as if Joan cast a spell on her or something. How could you be so easily swayed to do something so horrific? Golden dressed in blue jeans, a khaki coat, red gloves, heavy makeup, and a domino mask, which is one of those small masks that basically just goes around your eyes. It's not like it covered her face or hid her appearance much at all. That evening, Joan had borrowed a car from another friend, Margaret Barrett. Around 9 p.m., she drove to Community Street, parked across from the Fabiano home, and waited. Richard was Betty's eldest child. He was at home that day, but he left for San Diego to the Navy base. Her daughter, Judy, was a teenager still living at home. In that stage where you're too old for trick-or-treating but haven't gone to college yet, where dressing up becomes cool again, I have very fond memories of attending college Halloween parties. Anyways, Judy spent the evening in her room, and around 11 p.m., Betty and Peter cut the lights and crawled into their bed. Joan and Golden had been staking the place out for over 2 hours. Now that they have gone to bed, it was time. Golden walked up to the front door of the Fabiano home and rang the doorbell. Peter and Betty looked at each other in confusion. Who would be at the door this late? Betty suggested perhaps it was a trick-or-treater. Peter reluctantly got out of bed and grabbed the bowl of candy. The doorbell rang a second time. As he opened the door, he asked, "It's a little late for this, isn't it?" To his surprise, he sees an adult woman standing in front of him. She has on a mask and is holding a paper bag in one hand. Just then, she raises the paper bag and says, "No," in a deep masculine voice. Then she pulls the trigger, hitting Peter in the chest at point-blank range. Betty heard the bang and yelled down to Peter. Golden ran across the street and jumped in the car. Joan leaned in, gave her a kiss, and said thank you, then sped off. When there was no response, Betty jumped out of bed and rushed downstairs. To her horror, she found Peter lying on his back inside the front door in a pool of his own blood. Betty stayed by his side and sent her daughter Judy to the neighbors to get help. 2 doors down lived Bud Alper, a Los Angeles police officer. Judy frantically explained her stepfather had been shot, and he called in for backup. Peter was rushed to Sun Valley Receiving Hospital. He was shot just below his heart and lost too much blood. He died shortly after arriving. After the shooting, Joan drove back to return the borrowed car. She parked on the street, and the two took off in different directions on foot. Joan looked at Golden and said, "Forget you ever knew me." Excuse me? I just committed murder for you, and you're going to say, "Forget you ever knew me"? F that. Plus, Golden is now left with the murder weapon. She didn't know what to do with it. She hid it in a paid storage locker at Bullock's department store. Golden burned the costume she was wearing that night, all except for the khaki jacket that was accidentally left behind in Margaret's car. An investigation was opened into the murder of Peter Fabiano. The crime scene didn't provide any evidence to point them in the right direction. No shells from the gunshot, no fingerprints, no Ring doorbell cameras, because it's 1957. The only thing noted from that night was a neighbor who witnessed a car speeding off around the time of the murder. Initially, the murder seemed like it could have been a hired hitman, but Peter was clean. He did have one charge as a bookie, but those days were in his past. No one knew him to have any enemies. Family and friends were interviewed to eliminate suspects. The only person that stood out in Betty's mind was Joan Rebel. She knew that Joan was really upset about the abrupt end to the relationship. Joan was interviewed but remained tight-lipped. She gave no indication that she had anything to do with it. She claimed to be home all evening, and her neighbors confirmed her car hadn't moved. 2 weeks went by without any new leads. Joan and Golden figured they had committed the perfect crime. But the gun that Golden hid in a storage locker at Bullock's department store had been discovered. It wasn't hard to trace it back to the store where it was purchased, and receipts showed that the gun was registered to Golden Pizer, even though in my research I found that Joan was the one who actually purchased the gun. Either way, it led police to Golden's home. She didn't even try to deny it. She broke down confessing everything. She said, quote, "It's a relief to get it off my mind." She was arrested along with Joan Rebel, who continued to deny involvement. Both women were interviewed by a psychiatrist to see if they were fit to stand trial. Being gay was basically considered to be a mental illness in these days. Golden's attorney had her plead not guilty by reason of insanity. Not just because she's a lesbian, but because she was easily influenced and Joan took advantage of her. In court, she said, quote, "I had no motive personally. Whatever motive I had was to please Joan. I was always easily influenced. I have been impressionable and always trusting." Sorry, Golden, but being a trusting person doesn't make you legally insane. Joan also pleaded not guilty, just straight up denying involvement. During the trial, Golden showed remorse. She sobbed and had deep regret for her actions. Joan said nothing and had a shitty grin on her face the whole time. Both women were found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced 5 years to life in prison. I couldn't find details on exactly how long they actually served, but I do know that both women were released at some point. Golden died at age 83 and Joan at age 81. Betty never remarried. She sold the beauty salons after Peter's death and lived the rest of her life as a widow. It seems like this story is mainly remembered because of the fact that these women were lesbians. This is an example of a headline I found during my research. The bizarre lesbian murder scandal that rocked 1950s LA. In 1957, being homosexual was actually illegal in California. That's just crazy to me. In fact, sodomy of any kind, be it with another man, woman, or beast, was considered illegal. And I agree bestiality should be criminalized because an animal cannot give consent and it's disgusting. But it's ridiculous to me that you can be told what you can and cannot do sexually with another person in the privacy of your own home. It wasn't until the 1960s that the law changed. The United States Supreme Court established that within the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, there exists a right to privacy that prevents states from interfering with people's control of their own bodies, disrupting personal relationships, and intruding into the innermost sanctum of the home, the bedroom. Honestly, as long as it's consensual, who gives a shit? But to be honest, I wasn't able to dig up any dirt on the women in this story. There's no proof that a sexual relationship happened between any of them. I think it's more assumed. But then again, it makes sense for Joan to be so devastated to lose a lover versus a friend. But, people have killed for stranger reasons. This is just one more reason for me not to answer my door. If I'm not expecting a guest, I literally don't even look to see who it is. I just ignore it. And my poor neighbor has popped over randomly a few times and then texts me to say, hey, it's me. Open up. But seriously, just a word of advice. Lock your doors. Don't open it for strangers. Use your peephole, and if you feel inclined to interact, don't be afraid to shout through the door and ask what they want. The way I see it, it's your home. You are not obligated to open your door for anyone. Thanks again to my dad and everyone at Falcon Settlement Incorporated for sponsoring today's episode. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please take a moment to leave me a review. It helps so much with the visibility of my show, which is growing every week thanks to my awesome listeners. You can also leave a review on the Facebook page. My handle for Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok is at Killer Stories Podcast, and you can find me on Twitter at Killer Stories PC. Email me story suggestions to KillerStoriesPodcast@gmail.com. I have one more spooky season episode to write, and then I'm diving back into listener stories. If you want to support the show, you can find my link tree in the show notes. You'll be able to access buymeacoffee.com and the merch store from there. By the way, if you do buy some merch, please take a picture and tag me. I want to see you. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, this has been a killer story.